I am Mauro, a paranormal researcher for over 40 years. I will be reading accounts from people who have had a paranormal experience. The names of the people in these accounts will be altered to maintain the integrity of those involved. My name is Sarah. I've always been skeptical, one of those people who, no matter how many stories I heard from others, thought it was all just superstition or imagination. But everything changed one night, and I'm going to tell you what happened, even though to this day I still have trouble fully believing in what I experienced. I lived in an old house in the countryside, one of those buildings that's been around for decades, with old furniture and walls that creak at the slightest movement. The house was inherited from my grandmother, who, like most people in our family, always believed in spirits. I, on the other hand, never paid much attention to that. But something in that house felt different. There was a heavy atmosphere I couldn't explain, a constant feeling that someone was watching me, especially at night. It was an ordinary night, nothing special, but something felt off. I was upstairs where my bedroom was, and the silence of the house was absolute, as it always was. At 2 a.m., I was already lying down, trying to sleep, when I heard something very subtle. At first, I thought it was the wind hitting the windows, but soon I realized it wasn't that. I heard footsteps, heavy footsteps, as if someone were climbing the stairs. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the footsteps kept getting closer. I froze in bed. I couldn't move. My body was completely rigid. And then the footsteps stopped at the door of my room. I didn't know what to do. I tried to call my husband, but my voice was stuck, as if something was preventing me from speaking. That's when, to my horror, the door to my room began to open by itself, slowly, as if no one were on the other side. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The door opened completely, and there was no one there. The silence once again took over the house, but something was terribly wrong. I looked down the hallway and saw nothing, but the feeling that something was right there in front of me was palpable. Then suddenly I heard a voice. It wasn't an ordinary voice. It was low, whispering, as if someone was speaking directly into my ear, but without being physically there. I looked down the hallway again, and then I saw a shadow. It was a hooded figure. I couldn't make out any details, but what I saw was enough to freeze me. I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. My body felt like it was being paralyzed by the presence of that being. The shadow stopped at the door of my room. The coldness intensified drastically, as if the temperature around me had dropped several degrees in seconds. I could see my breath, as if it were the coldest winter. It wasn't just the temperature that had changed, but the very energy of the house seemed to have shifted from something safe and calm to something deeply threatening. With all my effort, I finally managed to move. I got up from the bed and ran to the door to close it, but as I touched the doorknob, something made me hesitate. There, at the end of the hallway, I saw a pair of red eyes glowing in the darkness. They were fixed on me. They weren't human eyes. They were deep, almost supernatural red eyes that seemed to penetrate directly into my soul. I felt an enormous weight on my chest. Every step I took away seemed harder than the last. My vision started to blur, and the feeling that something was pulling me back was overwhelming. I tried to run towards the stairs to go down and escape to the lower floor, but before I could reach it, the shadow materialized in front of me. I fell to my knees, completely stunned. The shadow, now clearer, revealed itself as a human figure, but with a dark aura and a cadaverous appearance. Its skin was pale, its eyes still red, and its hands, like claws, reached out to touch me. Fear took over me, but at the same time, something inside me told me that I needed to look into the eyes of that thing. When our eyes met, that's when suddenly the figure disappeared. There was no sound, no movement. It was as if it had been swallowed by the darkness itself. I was alone again. panic didn't leave me in peace. I ran down the stairs, exited through the front door. I sat outside for hours, explaining to my husband what I had witnessed. I was sobbing, still terrified. When I finally returned, I searched for some logical explanation. I checked everything, the doors, the windows, the electrical system, but found nothing that justified what had happened. What I saw that night was real as I am here now, and to this day, I wonder what really happened in that house. I could never stay alone in that house again, and over time, I ended up moving out. Every time I remember that night, I feel a chill, as if that thing is still watching me, waiting. I don't know what it was, but I can guarantee one thing. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. It was real. My name is Julia, and what I'm about to tell you happened a few years ago when I worked as a nurse in a very old hospital. It was a place that had a reputation for having a heavy energy, but no one openly talked about it. I never believed much in supernatural things, but that changed in a way I could never have imagined. I was working the night shift as part of my rotation. It was nearing 3 a.m., and the hospital was quieter than ever. I was on duty, alone, in one of the oldest wings of the hospital. That wing wasn't used much anymore, but from time to time, a seriously ill patient would be placed there when the other rooms were full. I always thought that wing had a strange atmosphere. The walls were worn, the furniture was old, and even though the hospital was large, I could feel that the energy in that part of the building was different. It was as if the place carried something heavy. I always avoided staying there alone for too long. That night, an elderly patient, Mrs. Thomas, was brought in as an emergency. She was very ill with severe respiratory problems and had to be constantly monitored. I knew her condition was serious, so I didn't think twice about staying longer to make sure she was comfortable. That's when the first strange things started to happen. I was in the nurse's station, filling out some notes, when I heard a sound coming from one of the rooms in the wing. It was like someone was walking. I looked out into the hallway, but it was completely empty. And the strangest thing was that the sound didn't seem to come from footsteps. It was like a shadow dragging itself, something that made a dragging sound, almost like a whisper on the floor. I was suspicious, but since I was already tired, I decided to ignore it and continue with what I was doing. Suddenly, the hallway light began to flicker. The first thing I thought was that it could be an electrical problem, but no. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just a simple flicker. The light flickered in a strange way, as if something was trying to interfere or hide in the shadows. The sensation grew stronger, and I started to feel a chill down my spine. For a moment, I looked towards the source of the sound, and I thought I saw something, a shadow moving down the hallway. I quickly turned my head, but there was nothing there. I tried to push that thought away, convincing myself that it was just the fatigue and the heavy atmosphere. But as time went on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I was heading towards Mrs. Thomas's room to check her vitals when I felt something strange. It was like a presence in every corner of that hallway. I could feel that something was watching me. When I entered Mrs. Thomas's room, she was sleeping. At that moment, she was in a very fragile mental state due to her illness. The room was very quiet. I could only hear the sound of the electrocardiogram, but the feeling that something was wrong increased with every passing second. The light in the room flickered twice. When I went to the door to check, I saw nothing. But when I looked down the hallway, something made me stop. One of the wheelchairs, which had been leaning against the wall, moved forward and stopped. I felt a chill, a heavy sensation. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, but my body was paralyzed with fear. At that moment, something inside me told me that I needed to go there, that I needed to understand what was happening. So I did. I walked down the hallway, and the closer I got to the chair, the stronger the feeling of terror became. My heart was pounding, but what made me stop was the sound of children's laughter. And shortly after, the dragging sound intensified, as if it were coming toward me. I didn't know what to do. I ran back to Mrs. Thomas's room, and when I got there, she was staring at me with wide eyes. The pressure in the room was so intense that I couldn't bear it any longer. Then, without warning, Mrs. Thomas let out a deep sigh, closed her eyes, and within seconds, she passed away. I stood there, paralyzed, watching her as the electrocardiogram registered that her heartbeat had stopped. I couldn't believe what had just happened. When I left the room, I no longer heard those sounds, but the feeling that something dark had happened that night stayed with me for a long time. After that shift, I always avoided going back to that wing. The hospital changed, the administration renovated the facilities, but to this day, I can't explain what happened that night. That presence, that shadow, that wasn't something normal. My name is Charles, and I've been a truck driver for over 20 years. I've driven more than 2 million miles on these roads, from north to south across the country, and I can tell you that I've seen it all. But what happened to me that night, I still can't explain. I was making a trip between Chicago and rural Illinois, a route I know like the back of my hand. It was already past midnight, and I was on the most isolated stretch of highway, the part where the vegetation is so dense, it feels like the world has disappeared behind me. I was alone in the truck's cab, driving calmly, as usual. The road was pretty deserted, and the only thing breaking the silence was the sound of the engine and the road beneath the tires. But at one point, something made me feel like I was being watched. It was a strange sensation, like someone was sitting in the passenger seat watching me, but when I looked over, the seat was empty. I thought it was just fatigue, since I'd been driving for over 10 hours, but soon after, the atmosphere started to change. The truck's lights began to flicker for no reason. I fiddled with the dashboard, but everything seemed fine. The wind outside got stronger, and the sound of the road seemed different. It was as if something was coming toward me from a distance. That deserted road had its mysteries, and I knew that. Every now and then, you hear stories from drivers who swear they've seen things on that stretch, but I always thought they were just urban legends, until it happened. I was driving when, suddenly, I heard a strange sound. It was a soft tap on my side window, like someone was trying to get my attention. I looked to the side quickly, but saw nothing, just the emptiness of the road and the thick vegetation. However, the tapping continued, now louder, as if someone was tapping their fingers on the glass. I froze. I thought it might be an animal or even another driver trying to stop me, but when I looked again, there was no one there. I pulled over to the shoulder, my heart racing. I got out of the cab and walked to the side of the truck, but there was no one. There weren't even any footprints on the ground, as if someone had stopped there. Everything was too quiet. I got back into the cab, and soon after, the atmosphere grew even stranger. I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was there with me. It was dark, and the only light I had was from the dashboard and the headlights. Suddenly, the truck's radio turned on by itself. The song playing was an old tune from a time I didn't even remember anymore, something from the 70s. I started to get even more nervous. The road was silent, but something felt terribly wrong. The sound on the radio began to distort more and more. I turned off the radio, but the feeling that something was following me didn't go away. At times, it even felt like the truck was heavier, as if it were carrying an extra load. I decided to stop again, now at a gas station a little further down the road. When I got out of the truck, I tried to relax a bit. I went into the station store and grabbed a coffee. When I returned to the cab, I noticed something even stranger. The passenger seat, which had been empty before, was now slightly depressed, as if someone had been sitting there. I was alone. I was sure of it. I got back into the truck and tried to hit the road, but deep down, I wasn't sure I could continue. That's when I looked into the rearview mirror and saw a shadow, something not reflected properly. It was like a figure sitting in the passenger seat, but it had no defined shape. It was a dark silhouette that seemed to move and distort with every moment. The shadow had no face, no body, but it was there. I started to speed up, trying to escape that feeling. But the faster I drove, the closer the figure seemed to get. The radio turned on again, now making a crackling noise, growing louder with each passing second. I didn't know what to do anymore. I started praying and rocking in my seat, staring straight ahead, trying to ignore it. The feeling was palpable. I looked ahead, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly, but that presence, that invisible figure, I decided I had to stop again. The gas station was already a bit far, but for some reason, I didn't want to keep driving without stopping. When I finally stopped, I ran to the rest area and locked myself inside. Even though I felt a little safer, the experience left me so shaken that in the following days I had nightmares, and the feeling of being followed never left me. I tried to rationalize it all, but to this day, I still can't understand what happened that night. I didn't see a ghost, I didn't see anything concrete, but something on that road. Something was there with me. Nowadays, whenever I pass through that same stretch of highway, since there's no better route, and the only other option would add another 2 hours to my trip, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. The music on the radio, the dark figure in the passenger seat. I don't know what it was, but I can guarantee you it wasn't just in my head. Something happened, and I will never forget it. If you ever find yourself on a deserted road at midnight, pay attention, because sometimes you may not be alone. My name is Helen, and I'm the principal of a private school in a small town. I've always been a very rational person, someone who believes in what I can see and explain. But what happened that night, inside my own school, completely changed my perception of the unexplainable. It was a Tuesday, and the day was coming to an end. I was in my office, alone, reviewing the projects that the teachers had sent me. It was that time of year when we were planning for the next semester, so everyone was busy, and I needed to pay close attention to every detail. The building was calm and silent, which is normal at night. It was past 10 p.m., and the last group of staff had left. The library was closed, the cleaning crew had finished their shift, and I was there alone with a stack of papers. The more I looked over the projects, the more my fatigue grew. Suddenly, I heard something strange coming from the hallway. It was a muffled sound, like soft footsteps on the wooden floor. I thought someone had forgotten something or had come to speak with me, but when I looked, there was no one there. I kept reviewing the documents, trying to ignore the sound, thinking maybe I was just imagining things. The school had many wooden areas, so occasionally a creak in the floor was normal. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. The footsteps repeated, and they seemed to come from the direction of the teacher's lounge. It was a clear, rhythmic sound, but there was no one there. The sensation that something was moving in the building grew stronger. I went to the door and looked down the hallway. Everything was silent. The only sound now was my heart pounding in my chest. I went back to my office and continued working, but now I felt like someone's eyes were on me, like I was being watched, but I couldn't tell from where. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe. The walls, which were usually comforting and familiar, began to feel cold and distant. I tried to concentrate on my work, but I couldn't. Then the lights started to flicker. One first, then another. I looked at the light switch, but everything seemed in place. The power system was working fine, and I knew it well since I'm responsible for all the school's maintenance. Fear started to take over me, but for some reason I couldn't leave. I was trapped there, in this environment that was becoming more and more strange. As I stepped out of my office, the hallway seemed longer, darker than I remembered. I passed by the teacher's lounge, and that's when I saw it for the first time. It wasn't a person, but a figure, a shadow, something that seemed to float along the walls, making no sound. I froze. The shadow had no defined shape, but it had a presence, something that seemed to suck in the light around it. I took a deep breath and continued forward, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I walked, the shadow seemed to follow me. I couldn't see it directly, but I could feel its presence, and the strangest part, every time I looked back, it was closer. I went to the teacher's lounge and opened the door, but what I found there was nothing like what I expected. The bulletin board was all messed up, as if someone had moved the papers around. Papers were scattered on the floor, but I was sure I had left everything organized before I left. The strange part was that I didn't even hear the papers falling. The only sound was my own heartbeat. I crouched to pick up the papers, and when I looked up, the shadow was there, standing in the doorway, watching. I couldn't think anymore. Fear took over reason, and I rushed to the window, looking outside, as if the streetlight could offer me some comfort. I took a deep breath, and as I looked to the side, I noticed that the clock on the wall had stopped. It was 3:03 a.m., and I knew time hadn't stopped. I looked back at the hallway, and the shadow was still there, moving strangely. But as I directed my eyes down, I saw two hooves, like those of a goat or a horse. Not knowing what to do, I ran to the lobby and called security. I didn't want to spend another minute there, but something inside me told me that this presence wasn't going to let me leave so easily. Security arrived within minutes, but when they entered the school, they found nothing. They checked all the floors, every room, and there was no one. Not even the strange sound I had heard earlier was there. That night I left as quickly as I could. I kept thinking about everything that had happened. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a big coincidence. Maybe something wrong with the power system or my mental state. But since that night, I've never been able to look at the school the same way again. I don't know what happened that night, nor who or what was there, but I can guarantee one thing. There was something there, and I'm certain of it. My name is Cynthia. It was a Friday night, and I was at home alone with my 7-year-old son. My husband had traveled for work, and I was enjoying the silence to get some house chores done. It was around 10 p.m., and the atmosphere was calm. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't cold either. A normal night, or at least it seemed that way. My son, Liam, was already in bed, and I was in the living room, fiddling with my phone. Suddenly, I heard a sound coming from the stairs, like someone was slowly climbing. I thought it was Liam, but when I checked the clock, I saw he was deeply asleep. I got up and went to the stairs to check if everything was all right, but there was nothing. The sound stopped. I went back to the living room and ignored it, thinking maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, especially since I'd been watching videos on social media. I went back to scrolling on my phone, trying to distract myself, but that's when the sound returned. This time, the steps were louder, as if someone was climbing quickly, almost running. I went to the stairs again, but this time there was nothing. The hallway was empty. I looked into Liam's room, and he was there, lying down in a deep sleep. I started wondering if I was imagining things, if the exhaustion was affecting me. But then, the worst happened. I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, trying to calm myself down. But the silence was now unbearable. That's when I heard clearly a whisper. It wasn't a loud voice, but it was distinct. It was as if someone was whispering right near me. But when I looked around, no one was there. The whisper seemed to come from the direction of the stairs, and I didn't know what to do. I froze for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. I knew it wasn't Liam. He was in his room and couldn't have moved that quickly. The house was too quiet. But that whisper, the feeling of being watched, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to check. So, with my heart racing, I went to the stairs again. When I put my foot on the first step, the air felt heavier. Each step felt harder, as if something was pulling me back. When I reached the top, The hallway was so dark that it seemed to swallow all the light from the house. The only sound was my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a few seconds listening, waiting, and that's when I heard it again, the whisper. This time, I could make out one word. Liam. I froze. The voice wasn't anyone I knew. It was a soft voice, but full of urgency, as if trying to call me to something. But when I looked to the end of the hallway, I saw nothing. Fear took over, and I quickly descended the stairs. But before I could reach the door, I heard a tap on the wall upstairs. It was like someone was gently tapping their hand on the wall, but with a rhythm, almost like communication, a code. I didn't know what to do. I rushed to Liam's room and woke him up. He was scared, but couldn't tell me what was happening. When I looked at the window, I saw the curtains moving, as if someone was pulling them from the inside out. But when I went over there was nothing. The wind wasn't strong enough for that. The weather was calm. I spent the night there in Liam's room, unable to sleep. I felt like there was something or someone somewhere in the house. The next morning, I told my husband, but he didn't believe me. He thought I was exaggerating. But what I experienced that night was real, and to this day, the whisper of my name still echoes in my head. I don't know what happened that night, but I can't forget it. And ever since, whenever I'm home alone, a part of me stays alert, waiting to hear that voice again. And these were the accounts for today. There are many other stories in my personal collection. Let us know in the comments which story you liked the most. We'll see you in the next video if you have the courage to come back.